Today on the Dig In podcast, I'm joined by Dr. James Tabor, Distinguished Fellow in Humanities at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and retired Professor of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, where he taught Christian origins in ancient Judaism for 33 years. Dr. Tabor is the author of 2 New York Times bestsellers, The Jesus Dynasty and Paul and Jesus, and has been co-director of the acclaimed Mount Zion excavation in Jerusalem since 2008. His work has been featured in Time, Newsweek, National Geographic, The History Channel, and dozens of other major outlets. His brand new book, The Lost Mary, Rediscovering the Mother of Jesus, published by Knopf, makes a stunning argument that Mary wasn't just the vessel who bore Jesus, but the revolutionary Jewish matriarch who founded Christianity and whose teachings we still hear in her son's words. Now it's time to dig in. Welcome, everybody, to the Dig In podcast. I am your host, Pastor Johnny Ova of the Sound of Heaven Church, and I have the privilege of having Dr. James Tabor on with me today. Dr. Tabor, thanks so much for joining us today. I can't wait to talk about all your work that you've been putting out there.
Well, it's my pleasure. I don't know much about your work, and you're learning about mine, so it's going to be a fruitful exchange, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's going to be good. And again, like I said, I do appreciate you being so gracious with your time today. So let's jump right in. You open your book, which we're going to get into. I know before you were just showing us the cover of it, with this paradox about Mary is the most famous woman in history, recognized by billions of Christians and Muslims, yet she's also the most erased woman in history. So I feel like it's a good place to start there. What do you mean by that Mary's erased?
It is a good place. In fact, the first line of the book, I won't get it exactly, but it's like Mary's the best known, least known woman in history. And I would stand by that. I mean, there's no question that she's the best known. Who would be a rival? If you even try to think of ancient women, because of the way we have forgotten women, not just Mary, but others. My students, I always do this in class, they'll come up, oh, Cleopatra, Helen of Troy. And usually they can't come up with another one from the entire ancient world. And then they'll go to Joan of Arc or Queen Elizabeth I or whatever. And yet, the men we can name. So it kind of starts there. But the erasure thing is something more. It's one thing for her. Well, let me illustrate it like this. Whether you know the Apostles' Creed by heart or not, I think you'll know this phrase, and people have heard it, Christians particularly who recite it. It's the earliest Christian creed, and it's about Jesus, not Mary. So what it says is, among other things, that he's born of a virgin, crucified, died, and buried, and raised the third day. Okay. So as I point out, even about Jesus, born, crucified, died, buried, and raised. Now, for the Apostle Paul, the entrance and exit points are sort of the main thing, particularly the exit, the crucifixion. As he says in 1 Corinthians, I made a decision to know nothing among you but Jesus Christ and him crucified. But if you put that on Mary, it's really odd. We almost get the same thing, but much less, because we have whole gospels about Jesus and some of his teachings. But what about Mary, birth of Jesus? Couple little things along the way. I counted 11 or 12 mentions of her. Now, John, for example, doesn't even give her name. Okay. That's a shocking fact to most people because we know her name and so we don't think of it when we're reading it. But, I mean, think about it. You write about Jesus and mention his mother 5 or 6 times, but you just say his mother. Then she's at the cross, and she's in front of the cross in all of our accounts. She's there with Mary Magdalene and this band of sisters that I talk about in the book that we need to remember because they're the loyal ones who stick with Jesus even to the end.
Right.
Whereas, as Mark says, the disciples, the followers, the apostles, they all forsook him and fled. So what about the middle? In other words, what about Mary's life? She's introduced at the birth of Jesus and she exit at the death. So what about her as she was as a woman? But the erasure comes from a different motive, not just a lack of historical information. I wish they'd written more about her. But there is this tendency, you've got to have the woman, the mother, to bring Jesus into the world.
Right.
But she must have had a life. We can say, well, she lived in Nazareth, and it's a small village, supposedly. We're going to talk about that, I'm sure,
Right.
because that's actually not a real understanding of the whole story of where that village was. We begin to see a erasure of the family, or let's just call it a fading of the family, like something kind of going out of focus. It happens with John the Baptist at one end. John sort of comes on stage, introduces Jesus, and then it's like, okay, I'm out of imprisoned by Herod Antipas, beheaded, and then Jesus carries on. And also, it happens with James, the Lord's brother, Jesus' brother, according to Paul. It turns out, when we get all of our historical material together, as I do in this book, James takes over the leadership of the Jesus movement at the death of Jesus. Now, you know that, I'm sure. And I think some of your more, I don't want to say enlightened followers, but followers and people that listen to you that have dug in a little bit into the history might know of James. His name in Hebrew is Yaakov, but we don't normally think of him as the leader. So it's sort of hidden in the New Testament. So how is it hidden? I'll give you an illustration. And this goes for the erasure of Mary too. When you go to our main account of the movement after the death of Jesus, it's in the New Testament. We call it the Acts of the Apostles. You get the 11 in the first chapter choosing a replacement for Judas, and then one line, and his mother Mary and his brothers were there. Okay, they're there. So you can't deny their presence. But Peter's clearly in charge. He stands up, he preaches, he says, let's do this, let's do that. Okay, without denying his central role with the 12, which I think he did have historically, talking about what we can restore historically, critically, reading the text carefully. And then James just disappears. In fact, he's not even introduced by name. His mother, Mary, and his brothers. We go to chapter 15, though, and it's the most momentous decision that the movement has to make. What are we going to do with non-Jews, Gentiles as they were called? Thousands of them are believing our message, but do they need to convert to Judaism? How much of the Torah should they keep? How much should we still keep? All of these questions. Peter speaks at this meeting. We usually date it 49 to 50 CE or AD. It's in Jerusalem, the headquarters. Paul speaks. All the apostles and elders are gathered. You've got to picture this gathering of, maybe way over 100 people, like a kind of a council,
Okay.
with all of them together. Remember, Jesus had those 70 followers that he sent out. They're kind of official, got this band of sisters. So let's say 100, 150 people altogether, maybe more than that. We don't know how many are at the conference. That could just be the main leaders. But then we have this chilling verse, to me, if you're not expecting it. After everybody's speaking, James stands up and says, my decision is. Now, if you had only read Acts to that point, or even Luke, the volume 1 of what we think is a 2-volume work, you'd go, James who? James who? He's not named in chapter 1, it's his brothers. What does he mean, my decision is? He's not making a decision just for the local Jerusalem congregation. He's making a decision for the worldwide movement, including Paul's followers.
Right.
And according to that, they make an agreement. We get another version in the book of Galatians, not that opposite. According to Paul, I went up to see the pillars of the church. Although in Greek, there's a phrase that I would translate as the RSV does, the so-called pillars of the church. And then he adds, what they are means nothing to me. That's kind of testy.
Yeah.
But in context, what he means is I've got my gospel. I know what I'm standing for because I'm talking directly to Jesus of Nazareth, the heavenly glorified Christ. And yes, I did go up to see them, but he calls them the pillars of the church. What are they? Who are they? James, Peter, and John, the son of Zebedee, is the John that's intended there. And he says they agreed with me. So Acts 15 says everybody agreed. And they made the decision that Gentiles do not need to undergo some sort of formal conversion to Judaism. They need to turn from idolatry, live a sexually moral life, and other things that in Greco-Roman society would not be obvious. He doesn't list things like don't steal and don't trip blind people and, don't be a nasty person. But
Right.
he does talk about the things that in the Gentile world might not be considered by a strict standard of biblical morality. So sexuality and idolatry being the main two. So she's faded even more than James. After that, all we have is the letter of James attributed to James. A lot of scholars have said, well, he probably didn't write it because it's really good Greek, but he might have written it. And what you do in those days, Josephus, the Jewish historian, says he did this. He wrote the Jewish War, this great work of history, and then he had it translated. He wrote it in Aramaic, his native tongue, and had it translated into this beautiful Greek that it is for us today.
Right.
So who's to say that James might not, whether he wrote the letter himself, dictated it in perfect Greek, I don't know, but it does seem to reflect something that we would call, it's a sort of funny adjective, a Jamesian slant on things, because it's not the Paul message. And even Luther said, I don't know if there's any gospel in this thing. And I think he might have put it in the first edition of the Luther Bible. I think he might have put it even in the back. Like, this is okay to read. It's from James, but, really, Paul should come first. So you have Acts, Romans, and then all the 13 letters
Right.
attributed to Paul. So that's what I mean by the best known, least known. What do we know about her life? And can we begin to decipher and put together some of the threads that we have? And I use the analogy of breadcrumbs sometimes, the famous breadcrumbs through the forest, where you follow a trail, but it's not so clear. You've got to go on down the trail and go, oh, we turn here and we turn here and we turn there and we find this and that. And when we do that, and we can go over some of those, there are only about a dozen, you can begin to construct a fuller picture of Mary, not just as the woman who bore Jesus and was present at the cross, but what I would call the lost Mary, who has largely been made the mother of God, the queen of heaven, the exalted one. And as you know, in Roman Catholic theology, although this comes late, she bodily ascends into heaven, just like Jesus did. And she's presumably, there's God the Father, Jesus the Son, and I guess Mary is just standing or sitting right there in Catholic Marian devotion and so forth. So that's opening kind of
I find this
response to that, and we can dig in any way you want.
Yeah, I really find this fascinating because you've written books on Jesus and Paul, and I remember you had mentioned in some of your writings that the search for Mary has been such a great challenge for your career. Why is recovering the historical Mary so much harder than recovering like the historical Jesus?
Well, it's because the family itself is fading away in our New Testament sources, and I think it comes mainly from the influence of Paul. Paul says things like this in 2 Corinthians. He says, we no longer know Christ after the flesh. Well, that's true. He's gone. He died. And Paul believes he's been raised to heaven and sits at the right hand of God. He believes he's talking to him. And then he adds something that's kind of interesting. Even if we once knew him after the flesh, we don't know him that way any longer. Now, that could be just a simple statement of he's gone to heaven. But remember, Paul never met Jesus. We have no evidence that he hung around him or listened to him. Now, he's in Jerusalem when these main events take place, that final Passover week when Jesus is crucified. So I think from a historical standpoint, we have every reason to believe he was aware of what was happening and was against Jesus and likely approved of the decision that was made that we need to get rid of this guy, this messianic imposter, this dangerous person who is going to just stir up trouble for us and cause the Romans to come and take away the little freedom that we do have to run our religion and run our temple. And we know he says that. He says, I was an enemy of this movement. But on the other hand, if you think about what else could be implied there, not just absence of Jesus, I think in that context, he's talking about the difference between the ones like the apostles, like James, who grew up with Jesus as his brother, and James and the other brothers actually grew up with Jesus. The other apostles spend 2 or 3 years with him. Now, Paul's not part of that. So all of those teachings that we read, that red letter material in some Bibles, the sayings of Jesus in our Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then John has the most.
Right.
Basically, Paul would have never heard any of that, even if we're getting a kind of theologized version later.
Interesting.
We don't know that he ever heard the teachings of Jesus. But not just the teachings of Jesus, but if you're around someone, a rabbi, and you're the disciples or students of that rabbi, that relationship is amazing. We know that culturally from Judaism of the time. Paul's not in that circle. He's not in the inner circle.
Right.
So I think he's also implying, okay, some of you knew Jesus, and you apostles knew Jesus. And remember, he says that the apostles travel through the churches. He mentions Peter. He calls him Cephas. He mentions other apostles, and he mentions the Lord's brothers who travel. So some of these brothers might have even come through town. And now in 2 Corinthians, when there's some divisions going on and problems, he says, look, we no longer know Jesus after the flesh. I see more behind that statement than a simple observation like, well, Jesus died and he's gone.
Right.
I think he's saying, in effect, I speak to the heavenly Christ. Yes, you spoke to the earthly Jesus, but, I'm not so sure that what you're getting now is equivalent to what I'm getting. Or you might say what you got back in those days.
Right.
I don't know if any of the apostles are claiming to get direct visions and revelations for their teaching as Paul is. So we have to think about that. And as we begin to put these little threads together or these little breadcrumbs together, we do begin to get the picture, but it's not huge chunks of teaching like we would have in the New Testament Gospels that we also have to critically read. And I try to go through and do that in the book a little bit with readers, just on a beginning level of what critical scholarship would say about the sayings of Jesus, and which are maybe the earliest and the most unedited and so forth.
Gotcha.
And then the other thing, though, that is huge is to take the tidbits that are almost explosive. For example, I'll give you 2 examples. One is a passing verse in Mark chapter 6, verse 3, okay, where Jesus is back in the Galilee in his hometown area around Nazareth. And what's said to him is, or about him is, the family. This guy, that's the son of Mary, right? And his brothers, James, Joseph, Jude, and Simon, we know them, and we know his sisters. Now, the scene is not about identifying the brothers, but look what happens. Because of Mark, our earliest gospel, most of us think, most historians think that, and Matthew and Luke use Mark as a source, we get the names of the brothers. So all of a sudden, James is first. That's going to connect to something else. Who's the beloved disciple at the cross? Everybody go, oh, that's John. Why would you think it's John? That tradition I trace in the book is very late. It's 180 Irenaeus.
Wow.
I think it's James.
Wow.
Who, if I'm the eldest son, my mother's a widow. Remember, Joseph just disappears. He's not around after the age 12 is the last word we get from Joseph. Something happens to him. So Mary's a widowed mother of 7, 8 children, depending on the sisters. And now Jesus is dying, and he says, son, here's your mother. Mother, here's your son. And he takes care of her. And what do we find on the day of Pentecost? His mother's there with the brothers. So I think, people are so shocked. Tabor said that James was the beloved disciple. Wow, I always thought it was John. Well, why would you think it was John?
Right.
There's no hint that it's John. And the first clue you would have, it needs to be somebody that's never named in that gospel. This is in the Gospel of John.
Right.
So you see, he's not named. Again, this sort of, well, let's don't say who this is because he's obviously in charge of the family and the mother, but we know it from other sources. So that's one verse to get the names in order like that.
Interesting.
And then the other verse is Matthew 1:25 about the birth of Jesus. Remember, in the Eastern Church, these kids that are named, you can't deny their existence, they're named. Those aren't children of Mary. She's a perpetual virgin. She never lives sexually with her husband. He's probably 95 years old in one of the texts, and those kids are from his previous marriage. He's an old man who's a widower, kind of like a caretaker. Well, you don't get that feeling at all in the Gospels.
No.
But in Matthew, what does it say? That Jesus is born. Well, actually, let me back up. And in the West, it even gets more removed, I think, from historical reality. Joseph can't have sexual intercourse either, so he can't be the old man that had all these kids before he married Mary.
Right.
Because now in the West, it's like, yeah, but Joseph is really holy. He's with the Holy Virgin Mary, and so he can't be sexually involved with anybody even before. And so these are kids of his brother. He had a brother named Clopas, and those are Clopas' kids. So we end up with cousins or stepchildren. But what does Matthew 1:25 say? So clear. Joseph has a dream. Your betrothed is pregnant. And when you're betrothed in Judaism at this time, we know the customs. You might wait months up to a year for the marriage consummation because a lot of things have to be arranged. But it's never like the next day. You get engaged and the next day you're married. And we have that today. People get engaged. Oh, when are you getting married? Oh, next June.
Yeah.
It's the same thing.
Yeah.
But from that moment on, engagement counts. Now, in a conservative culture, you're not supposed to sleep with one another until the marriage. Whether people follow that then or now, is an open question. But
Sure.
It's just considered proper.
Right.
You wait till the marriage, And so what does it say? He has a dream. And in the dream, he's told, don't put her away. Don't break the engagement. Don't put her to any kind of, and he was even thinking of doing it privately because he obviously loves her and likes her.
Right.
He didn't want to ruin her life. It's an unfortunate thing, however it's happened. But he's told, take her. So it says that that he took her as his wife, so they get married, but he did not sleep with her. Literally, it says he knew her not until she had brought forth Jesus, the firstborn. Well, until does imply pretty clearly, I think, by any normal reading. People argue, well, until doesn't imply anything after. Of course it does.
Right.
It's a marriage.
Right.
He takes her as his wife. That means to consummate the marriage in any tradition. And he didn't do that because of the pregnancy. But once Jesus is born, he obviously does. So there's just two verses,
Right.
Mark 6 and Matthew 1:25. And all of a sudden, we got brothers and sisters of Jesus. We got them living together as a normal Jewish couple, and children probably every 2 years. I'll get personal here. My father's mother had 12 children. One died in childhood.
Oh, wow.
Not birth, but so 11. I knew my uncles and aunts growing up. And what's interesting, and I learned this from other genealogical things, looking at old records of other people on both sides of my family. These kids were born about every 2 years. And if you're open to having children and whatever comes, and you're a fertile couple, you nurse maybe a year or so, and then another pregnancy, and
Right.
That's the way it works. And so it worked that way in my grandmother's family. It's not a strange thing at all. So if they're living together as husband and wife, there's going to be brothers. So what about the brothers? What about the sisters? And why don't we know more about them? So some of these little breadcrumbs, threads that you begin to pull, they're very revealing, like those two. Some of them, though, people have taken as negative. The main one is in Mark, and it's the case that many Bible readers will remember where Jesus is at home and at the house in Capernaum. People call it today Peter's house. I think it's probably because Peter and Andrew are not from Capernaum. They're actually from Bethsaida, which is around the lake, but probably maybe the Zebedee house is acting as host to the Jesus movement, like a headquarters.
Right.
It's a major port on the north of the Sea of Galilee, and the roads from the north come in right through Capernaum, and the roads going east and west down to Nazareth and Sepphoris, where he lived. I want to talk about Sepphoris in a minute. So basically, you can't get in even though the family's living there. Mother and brothers are seeking you. Knock, knock, knock. We can't even get in. You got so many people in the little area there. It's probably a courtyard and little rooms that you could kind of stand in and see Jesus teaching. And Jesus says in Mark, when he sees the crowd and they can't get in, and he's told, your mother and brothers are outside, they want to get in. He says, who are my mother and brothers? All of you are my mother and brothers. If you're here to do and seek the will of God, you're my mother and brothers. Now, I see that as positive. I'm not the only one. A few scholars. There's a wonderful scholar. I'm afraid I won't. Let's see. His name is. Well, I won't say it because I can't think of his name. Oh, I do. There's a wonderful scholar on James. I recommend this book if people are going, I don't know much about this James. It's called Just James, James the Just. So great title. John Painter. John Painter, easy to remember. Get that book, because my books has some of that in it. And he suggests this also. What is Jesus saying? He's saying, mi casa su casa, as we say. Right. Hey, my mother and brothers are outside. Hey, they live here. But you all are here. And I picture him after that. If I was doing a movie, I would have him say, you know what? There's room for everybody. Some of you go out in the courtyard. Also, let's get food. Let's have lunch together. Mom, come on in. Brothers, come on in. Look, meet some of these people that are here. Now you say, well, you don't know all that. No, I don't know all that. But I don't think he thinks his mother and brothers are negative. Sure. And you've got to read the entire book to get the whole argument. But more than the threads, positive or negative, however they're taken, and there are many more, but more than that, you also have other texts, and you have archaeology, and you have geography. And that, if you want me to just explain that, how that begins to contextualize.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So, two things that begin, if you begin to do the research that I did, and by the way, you mentioned the cover.
There it is.
That picture, I'll just pause here. Look at that. That's the Mona Lisa of the ancient world. It's by a Renaissance painter. He's Italian. You can read about him in the cover.
Yeah, wonderful. And I'm going to link all this stuff in the description
box.
box.
Look at that. What is she thinking? Boy, that face is thinking everything. So anyway, it's amazing. So let's start with where she lives. Nazareth. Everybody knows Nazareth. Boy, I pointed this out for years in my classes. The students are blown away. Where's Jesus from? Nazareth, Nazareth, Nazareth. If you go to Israel today, Nazareth is the largest city in the Galilee. Imagine. Nazareth, the little village that everybody says Jesus is from, and he is from there. He does grow up there. But what people don't know is that 4 miles to the north of the village Nazareth, just 4 miles, is Sepphoris, the largest urban center of the Galilee, the capital. So Jesus is growing outside of the capital of Herod Antipas. Herod the Great dies just after Jesus is born. 3 revolts break out all over the country, messianic revolts. Different Jews who want to take over and become king of the Jews now that the Herod the Great king is dead, the despot is dead. So Sepphoris is one of the centers of rebellion, and there's a rebel, as he's called, by his enemies at least, by the Romans, Judas, son of Hezekiah. That's not the later Judas the Galilean. He's in CE or AD. This is in the year 4 BC, right after Herod's death. And he breaks into the armory at Sepphoris, and he starts a revolt. The Romans come down with 3 legions. They simply burn Sepphoris to the ground. Now remember, Mary's in Nazareth, nursing Jesus. It would be late, probably the summer of 4 BC, because Herod dies in the spring. And she's still going to be nursing this child if he was born the year before, living now in Nazareth. And she's seeing the flames of the major city go up. Now, when I finished my PhD at the University of Chicago, I'm sorry to say I hadn't done archaeology. I traveled to Israel once as a kid, but I wasn't really familiar with it. I've been 78 times
Wow.
in my career since then, and I've excavated at half a dozen sites and so
Oh, how
forth,
exciting. That must have been something else.
including Sepphoris. I've dug there,
Okay.
excavated there for 3 different seasons. So it really came home to me. But I could, if you had said to me, back, I got my PhD in biblical studies. James, tell us a little bit about Sepphoris. You've learned all these things. Honestly, I think I would have said, what's that again? Sepphoris. Now, that means that I didn't read my Josephus carefully enough, because we had to read and study Josephus. But I don't know, it just didn't click with me that it was 4 miles from Nazareth. I think I might have said, oh, wasn't that like Herod Antipas's capital? But what you'd be asking is, no, tell us about the influence of that urban area. So the main north-south road from Damascus all the way to Egypt is going down through Sepphoris and across from the Mediterranean to the Sea of Galilee and over to Beit Shean and across into Jordan, and finally down to Amman, the capital, and the Decapolis. Now, Jesus travels all of those roads.
Right.
The Gospels say that he went through all the cities of the Decapolis. So we've got to restore this urban background to the Galilee. Josephus says there's 250 villages in the Galilee.
Wow.
It's a very small area. So it's not this movie version of this little village and nobody's around and you hardly ever see anything. It's a bustling urban center.
Sure.
And Jesus and his brothers and his father are probably working in Sepphoris as builders. The word tekton in Greek, translated carpenter in the King James Version and most subsequent translations. It's really unfortunate, but it gets tradition. It gets embedded in the tradition, and what can you do? Jesus is a carpenter. You see the license plates. My boss is a Jewish carpenter. Well, you should say a Jewish stonemason.
There you go.
It's more likely that he's a builder, and you build in stone in those times. And that's why he gives these stories about building. He's always talking about, now, foundations, have you ever noticed you've got to dig really deep and you can't put it on sand and so forth, and you got to have something really. He's probably done this, and I excavated there, and I was actually excavating a first century building and with my students. And you know what they're asking me the whole time? Dr. Tabor, we're down on this street from the first century. Could Jesus have laid this stone?
Right.
Streets are with. Of course, I say, you never know, kids. It's something to think about. But whether he walked this street, I would say 99%. I mean, this is the main east-west street going through this Roman rebuilt city. So all of a sudden, we're getting a different picture. And what's more, there's the largest city is Sepphoris. A city set on a hill cannot be hid. He had to be talking about Sepphoris. He grew up right there. But also just south in part of Nazareth, like if this is Nazareth, there's this other town. It's not called a city. So there's Sepphoris here, Nazareth, and this town called Yaphia, not Jaffa, Yaphia. And Josephus says, oh, that's the largest town in the Galilee. You know how cities spill over into big suburbs then? Think of New York City.
Yeah.
And as you go north, you get another big suburb. Or if you go east or south or wherever, well, not south in terms of New York City, but across the bay, you get other large population areas. So Jesus is urban, and we think Mary is born in Sepphoris and grew up there. The sources on that are late, but there is a first century house with a Byzantine church built over it that's now in ruins, and further a Crusader church that's still there. And I have pictures of it in my book. So this archaeology is more than the other foot dropping. So we've got these texts, we've got outside sources. We can begin to put in the archaeology and also finally the history of the times. Like when I talk about, and Sepphoris went up in flames and Mary is nursing Jesus. A whole new picture of Silent Night. It's not the day he was born, but the point is, what was it like? And it's sort of echoed in the story of Matthew about Herod destroying the infants, whether that's, most historians would say that's not historically exactly correct, but the idea that the Romans would have wiped out any kid that was of Davidic lineage and so forth is not so far-fetched. And they did it later. When Vespasian attacks Jerusalem in 70, much, much later, and destroys the city, afterwards he says, are there any more Davidic people out there, people of the family of David? We want to get rid of them all because they're a potential threat. And I quote all of that in the book. So you see, you begin to put this together. You got your little tidbits that you can expand. You've got the archaeology that gives you the setting. You got the historical context. So even though Mary, maybe she's, say, 14 years old when Jesus is born in, if we say 5 BCE.
Right.
Okay. So she wouldn't remember Herod because he's dying when she's just a teenager. Well, of course she would. You know, she's living in the Galilee, but the news of the country and what Herod is doing, and then his son, Herod Antipas, all of this is just on her front page, you might say.
Right.
I usually use the illustration of when I grew up, World War II was so in my memory, but I wasn't even born until after World War II.
Right.
I'm a baby boomer.
Okay.
But my father was in the war and so forth, and I went to England. He was a military Air Force officer. We went to England in the 50s. So as a kid, I was even seeing the bombed out London. And now, you see the idea. I didn't experience any of that, but I'm hearing about it. Adolf Hitler was talked about all the time with my friends growing up, you know, jokes about Hitler and so forth. I mean, you don't hear that as much anymore.
Right.
Little songs even about Hitler that I won't bother to sing to you right now. But it was, so Mary's the same way. When these, Herod, you're going to get in the book 2 chapters of that history. It's kind of dense, but you're going to find that it's sort of a page turner. You won't remember all the names, but as you go through, if you've read, I think you started reading it, you go through it and it's like, oh my, this is like what a time to live through.
Sure.
Because Herod is killing this son and this wife and that wife, and different things happening that are causing great stress in terms of the finances and what's happening in Rome and so forth. And his son, Herod Antipas, is living in Rome. He got his education in Rome. And then he comes in and takes over the Galilee. So Mary is aware of that when Jesus is born. And she's going to be talking to those boys and those girls about the things that she experienced growing up. Kind of like, oh, I remember the day that we got the word that Herod had his wife Miriam, the beautiful Hashmonean Jewish princess, killed, executed, because he thought she might be a threat to his lack of Jewish pedigree and royalness and so forth. Well,
Right.
Mary's going to hear that story.
Right.
And know about it. The book tries to put all that together and make a composite picture. I don't always know these things, but I try to offer the context for you to imagine.
That's great. I was actually going to go there in regards to Mary's specific, the upbringing. You mentioned the location, but what about, it seems that she was raised in one of the most brutal periods in Jewish history. I believe you mentioned Mary likely witnessed mass crucifixions as a young girl, and really painting that picture of the world that was around the time she was born, maybe around 19 BC, and things like that. So, and even what you just mentioned, where Herod the Great murdered his own wife, drowns her teenage brother in a pool of some sort. I mean, how does even that political violence also connect to Mary's family itself?
Well, I think it probably moves her in the direction, I don't know where she started with this, but a pious Jewish family of the lineage of David is going to be very aware of one chapter in the Hebrew Bible, in particular, Isaiah 11. And if you go to Isaiah 11, you get the whole messianic agenda of what the Jewish people then and down to this day are expecting. And what it says is that there will come forth from the stump of Jesse. Jesse's the father of David. So it's talking about a tree. We say today a family tree. So the family tree of David's father is cut off like a stump. That has to do with the Babylonian captivity. We usually date it 586, 587, 588. So almost 600 years before the birth of Jesus. What happens to the royal lineage? Well, essentially, the Babylonians ended with the final king of Judah, Zechariah, and he's blinded and finally executed, and his sons are killed. But that doesn't mean that all the descendants of David were slaughtered. There are some that survived, but they're going to be cut back drastically by those sort of moves. And that's several hundred years. Then you read through Isaiah 11, and it talks about a little branch will grow out of this stump. Now, it doesn't just mean the general line of David will survive. It's actually using a Hebrew word that you will know, ser, the branch. Nazareth, the town of the branch people. Branch town is what Nazareth means. So it probably gets his name. Apparently, it's been partially excavated where we have Nazareth today. Today, it's huge spillover because of Jesus. But in that day, the first century area down by the water source, there's a spring called Mary's Spring today. And right around there, maybe 100 people could have lived, little village. And then there's Yafia, then there's Sepphoris. So it's a very special village because these Davidic families live there. Now, she's well aware of that.
Right.
And she has seen that violence. The one that I mentioned first, when Judas, son of Hezekiah, is killed and his followers crucified to put down any possibility of revolt. And that was centered in the Galilee. So I think as she lived through. Now, I do want to correct this idea because you see this all the time in the movies, Christmas specials. The Romans are not walking through Nazareth and through Yafia and through Sepphoris, kicking over people's produce and shoving women and kids. This is just
Don't spoil it for me. Don't spoil the drama.
They weren't doing that. The Romans generally, they're up in Damascus with their legions, probably bored as hell and hoping a revolt doesn't break out, but they're ready. You got to have, what they're worried about is the Parthians. They're not worried about Galilee and Judea. You've got the Herod family is going to keep that under wraps. And later they put procurators over Judea after the other son of Herod, Archelaus, is deposed for various reasons that we won't go into. They're worried about the Persians. They call them the Parthians, is how they're known then, coming in and taking over the whole Eastern Mediterranean and getting a foothold on the whole Mediterranean Roman world.
Right.
It was their greatest fear. Not the German forests. Those tribes could be pretty fierce, but the Romans had held them at bay along the Rhine River, and that's sort of, we're okay. And then England, the same thing. We're okay. Halfway up in the British Isles, they had established the wall of Hadrian later. But what about the East? The Parthians had come in before and tried to support native Jews and Hashmoneans that would be loyal to more of a Jewish cause, that they thought, well, we can get the Jews to allow us to come because we're going to let them have their Messiah, so to speak, or one of their native rulers. So that's what they're worried about. So I just want to correct that. I'm not saying you would never see a Roman squad or centurion. Centurions are mentioned in the Gospels several times. So a centurion would be over a little military outpost of perhaps 100 people. But they're not persecuting the people all the time and beating them and whipping them like you see in the movies. But if there's any trouble, boy, could they come down hard. And that's the problem. So she witnesses all of that. And I have to wonder, as she's reading Isaiah 11, which is about this branch of David that's going to grow up, and he's going to become very great, and he's going to bless the meek and the poor. Notice Jesus teaching, blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek. First words out of his mouth, Isaiah 11. And eventually, though, he's going to do something very threatening. He's going to regather the 12 tribes of Israel and set up rulers over the 12 tribes. Now, many people would say, well, Jesus wouldn't do that. That sounds very political. What does he tell the 12? I've chosen you to sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Later, the church makes that spiritual in heaven. We're all spiritual Israelites. I don't know what tribe they think they're from, but in Jesus' day, no, if you say That's like choosing your cabinet. I've got a cabinet of 12. I'm over the 12. When I die, my brother will take over. Peter, you're in charge of the cabinet. You're like Secretary of State or whatever, something like that. You're kind of helping to run that aspect of it. And that's what Isaiah 11 says. And then it says he's going to go and bring the Gentiles in as well. And finally, the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord. As the waters cover the sea, and the wolf will dwell with the lamb, and there won't be any hurting or destroying or sacrificing. The temple will be a house of prayer for all people, and so forth. So all of that is in Isaiah 11. So Mary's thinking, how is that going to be done? And one of the phrases there, I wonder if she dwelt on, he will slay the wicked with what? The breath of his lips. Is he a dragon or something? I mean, is this a metaphor? Because Jesus said through his lips, love your enemy, do good to those who persecute you, and so forth. So I present in the book the case for nonviolent resistance. It's not the same as being a pacifist in an absolute sense.
Right.
But what it's saying is that Rome and the oppressive powers of the rulers of the world will not be overthrown by military might. They have to be overthrown by, I would call it subversion, messianic subversion.
Right.
And what he begins to do is raise together an egalitarian society where male and female, bond and free, rich and poor are all together in a community. And I mentioned that band of sisters. We don't know how many there were, but Luke in chapter 8 names 3 of them that we know: Susanna, Joanna, and Mary Magdalene, and many others. I don't know how many is, but I don't think it's 1 or 2.
Right.
So it's dozens of women, and they're supporting the movement. It's an entourage.
Yeah.
Jesus later sends out 70 2 by 2. Now, does that probably means 35 teams? Those could be husband and wife teams. They could be brother and sister teams and others. We leave the women out.
Right.
It's really too bad. And that's how Mary, she bore Jesus, and I'm sure she was a good woman, God bless her. But no, she's the matriarch of this whole movement. She's behind it all. She is the one who birthed the movement that Jesus then leads as the firstborn. And then James comes along. So, I've said often, you could imagine it a different way. You don't have to go with my way. You could say, okay, Jesus is the wunderkind, as we say. He's the genius. Mother's kind of, she's a nice woman, but kind of, I don't want to say a dullard and insult her, but she's not the inspiration spiritually. And those brothers, they didn't really like him. They were jealous. Okay, that's a portrait you could imagine. Many people have imagined that. But what about Mary being the one who taught Jesus when he's 3, 4, 5, 6? Remember that book, All We Need to Know We Learned in Kindergarten? Years ago, I read it.
I do remember that.
I need to remember the author's name and give him credit. What a wonderful book. And it's so true. The basic ethics that every one of us know, like Paul says, the law is written in your heart. It really is. What does the teacher say in first grade? Don't take that away from Bill. Bill was playing with that. How would you feel if I took your toy? And the kids, yeah, okay. Unless he's a little mean kid, then he needs to learn not to be a little mean kid. But nobody's questioning the standards, right?
Of course.
We all know when you get sent to the principal's office that you did something wrong. Everybody agrees, even the kid that did it. Yeah, I shouldn't have done that. So, why do we picture, I know this is being kind of trivial maybe, but not really, the hand that rocks the cradle, rules the world.
Yeah.
And whatever we teach our kids right now in our culture today, whatever those little 2 and 3-year-olds are learning, and 4, 5, 6, before they even go to school, that is the future of this country right there.
Right. Yep.
And if they're learning the ethics and they're learning love and understanding, and so I believe that Mary would be the inspiration for that. And I think Jesus honors her in that way. And remember, she lived after Jesus. Now her son James is in charge.
Right.
Well, she taught him as well. Read the book of James again.
Right.
So I hope, some of that all I know it's kind of tangled and you put it all together,
No,
but
it's you're
when
painting
you
a
read the book, you'll see the sweep of it.
yeah, you're painting an amazing picture here, and some of the information's been incredible because some of it is, we're just not taught. It's just not common to be taught. So it's exciting to hear some of those things. So we are a little bit tight on time, but I have to ask you this question. So we're gonna end with this because I'm gonna let you go. So there's no time constraint on your answer on this, but I wanted to get to this, and that's the title, the chapter titled "Mary's Secret." And
Okay.
it deals with a question that I feel most scholars would like to avoid. A lot of Christians avoid this too. And you put out there that if Joseph wasn't Jesus's biological father, my question, I guess, would be, do we have any idea who was? And you trace this name Pantera through multiple ancient sources. So what did you find with this? And if you could dig deep in
Sure.
a little of that for me.
And remember the title, Mary's Secret, so I don't know. But there are only three possibilities. No father, which billions of Christians would say, well, there's no father. Why are you even discussing that? If you approach things as I do as a historian, I can understand how that story in Matthew and Luke can be told within a Greco-Roman context because we're familiar with the other men, Alexander the Great, Plato, various philosophers and rulers who had human fathers, and people know it. Like we know Alexander the Great's father was Philip. So why do we get stories that before he was born, a god came and was with his mother in some way? It's very mythological and so forth. So whether you take it that way or not, so no father or a god for the father, okay, or a human, another man. Then you got Joseph and question mark, another man. So what I feel obligated to do in that book, and this is why I do it, and usually it's avoided, is trace those two possibilities, Joseph and another man. Now, I think most of my colleagues, I haven't done a poll, obviously, scientifically, but just knowing what people usually say, talk about biblical scholars that take a historical, critical reading of these texts, would probably say, look, the father's Joseph, and the virgin birth story is just a way of desexualizing and honoring Mary because there's this growing view that holiness and sexuality are not opposed, but could be separated more properly. A really holy person doesn't need to get married and live a sexual life. And a bit of that comes from Paul, but it really comes from what we call Neoplatonism. It's just in the atmosphere in Greco-Roman culture. So it's easier just, hey, it's Joseph. Be done with it. But what began to intrigue me is that in Jewish sources, early Jewish sources, Sepphoris in the second century, so that would be the 100s, so 110, 120, there are rabbis in Sepphoris. So we're in the local area and we're a generation after the destruction of Jerusalem, where Jews are living in Sepphoris. It's a Jewish city, and it's a very thriving Jewish city at that time. It's kind of the center, even after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70. All the Jews didn't leave the country. And that's where the Mishnahs, for example, was finally put together and some of those things. So it's really important. And in some of the Jewish sources, we have Jesus mentioned. He's called Yeshua bar Pantera, or Pandira sometimes. It's spelled different ways, but Pantera is the Greek way. So Yeshua bar, son of Pantera. And you think, well, they're slandering him. They're claiming that some Roman soldier named Pantera impregnated Mary. That's a later story. Forget that story. That's 180, 190. Celsus, a critic of Christianity, writes a book and he spins that story. And so that's another time and place. I'm talking about right after the destruction of Jerusalem, when Jews are regathering and people are alive who remember Jesus, and they're 4 miles from Nazareth, remember. So 4 miles from Nazareth, local rabbis are talking about Yeshua ben Pantera, Yeshua ben Pantera. And guess what? They're telling positive stories about him. So if it was a pejorative term, Jesus, that son of that Roman soldier, and she's like a slut who slept or was raped by a Roman, that's not the idea at all.
Right.
So later, this gets picked up because of Celsus, that Greek philosopher, and so forth, that Jesus ben Pantera is a pejorative name, a negative name. I don't think it is. Now, I'll give you one of the stories. I know we're tight on time, but you got to hear this story. It's in the book. Rabbi Eleazar, great rabbi, so respected in the Mishnah, in the Talmudic literature. He says, one day in the academy, we were discussing what to do with the wages of a harlot in the temple. Now, there's no temple, but the Talmud discusses theoretical matters because they have principles to them.
Sure.
So if a prostitute wants to give, should we take the money?
Right.
It's a logical question. Yeshua ben Pantera said, I heard him say, why don't you build toilets with that money? And he said, sort of like that idea. And then Yeshua quoted a scripture from Micah, something about, I need to look it up, but it's in the book. From filth goes filth, or something like that.
Right.
And if you know rabbinic literature, that's what the rabbis do all the time. They kind of play with word plays and scriptures, and they say this is that, and this is like that, and so forth. And that's how they operate, and then they form these different views and what we call halakhic opinions. So Jesus a couple of times is quoted positively, and he's just referred to as Jesus Pantera. So I began to look in the church fathers, and I thought, well, they should be identifying this Roman soldier and defending, like, no way did that happen. And they don't say that. You know what they say? And these are church fathers that do not like Judaic Christianity, like Ebionites and the Nazareth. They don't like them. They think they're too Jewish.
Right.
So they're not prejudiced that way. And you know what they say? They say, well, that's a name in Joseph's family, Pantera.
Okay.
It's a family name. Now, that could work two ways. There could be somebody named Pantera in the family that Mary could have fallen in love with and been with and considered to be her treasured one, her soulmate. I mean, it's Mary's secret. We don't know. Or it could just be a way of referring to the Joseph family more generally. But what I began to notice, and what I point out in the book, there are little hints in other texts in the Gospels and outside the Gospels. The best known is in John. We weren't born of fornication. These are the Pharisees saying to Jesus, we weren't born of fornication like you. Like we've got some stories about your mother. So apparently in his own lifetime, it wasn't just a regular marriage. Betrothed to Mary, gets married, nothing ever said, okay, glory, hallelujah, we got the family.
Right.
There are things going on.
Do you think that could have just been by accusation, though? Like when they make a statement like that saying, hey, you're telling me you were born of God. I think your mother slept with somebody. You know what I'm saying? Like when they're saying, like the reputation rumor aspect of it.
I think that's entirely possible. And so this is a light thesis of mine. And even if it is Pantera, Joseph could have a family clan named Pantera. So when you say Yeshua bar Pantera, Yeshua from that Pantera clan, that could be the meaning. It doesn't have to mean that's the biological father. So usually if I talk about it as we're doing, I would say, okay, let's fill out Jesus' birth certificate. I'm going to put question mark by father and Mary the mother. But I could almost pencil in Joseph too, because, Jesus is called son of Joseph numerous times. And we have this ossuary also of James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, and even one that says Jesus, son of Joseph. Now, whether that's Jesus of Nazareth or not, it shows the pattern of naming and a family and so forth. So, it's her secret. I leave it at that. But I'm glad you brought it up, and people have to ask that. They have to wonder about that.
Sure.
As they search for the historical Jesus and the historical.
Yeah, no, it's really just all of it, just fascinating conversations. I enjoy the journey of talking about it, thinking about it. studying it up. But Dr. Tabor, this has been a blessing to me. It really has been. And your knowledge is just incredible. I'm going to link all your books. For those of you who are watching or listening right now, please check out Dr. Tabor's work in his book. And is there any way for people to get a hold of you if they have any questions about anything?
The best way to get hold of me probably is my blog, jamestabor.com. And from that, you can get links to all other kinds of things that I do, including a newsletter. If you get the newsletter, you can just hit reply and I get it personally.
There you go. There's the sneaky tidbit.
That would be the easiest. So jamestabor.com, easy to remember. That lists the books, that lists everything.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Tabor. I appreciate your time today. And we definitely got to have you on again in the future.
Okay. Thanks, Johnny. I appreciate being your guest. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Dig In podcast with me, Johnny Ova. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Follow us on YouTube, and don't forget to rate us 5 stars on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. You can also check out more at soh.church. See you next time as we keep digging in.